Alright, today I will be showing you how to clean a carburetor on a 2006 Yamaha Kodiak 400. A lot of the Yamaha four-wheelers are going to look real similar to this carburetor. I just wanted to show you how to go through and clean it and inspect it really well. So obviously I have the carburetor off the four-wheeler at this time, so we pulled this cover, the throttle cable coming down through this tab here, runs around this pivot point, and will set right down in this groove here with a fitting that looks similar to this. Cable's gonna hook in there. You're gonna spin that around and put this cap inside there. Then when you adjust your idle, essentially what that's doing, or you give it gas, it's gonna push this butterfly open. And again, this would be full throttle here, allowing as much air as possible flowing through there. So same thing, adjusting your idle, you're simply opening this butterfly up slightly. We've got your choke plunger here, and then we've got a port that runs out here, if you can see that, and those work hand in hand. You want to make sure that that port is cleaned out. When your plunger is in there, it's got a needle that you can actually see through this port here. So make sure that's cleaned out from any debris. And you want to make sure your idle is adjusted only when your four-wheeler is completely warmed up. So another trick I'll show you before we get too far into this carburetor is to check your diaphragm, make sure it's in working condition. Take compressed air here and blow through it. If you can blow into this port here and this slide goes up and down and moves freely, then more than likely your diaphragm is in good condition. So just inspect that. I like to pull that diaphragm anyways, just to look over it, make sure there's nothing in the wrong place, and I'll show you how to adjust that needle as well. So first things, grab, you got 4 Phillips screws all the way around this bowl here. You'll make sure you have a good screwdriver to take and pull these off. Sometimes they get rounded off, and if that's the case, you can grab a pair of small vice grips and try to get a hold of those screws to take them off. At that point, it's probably good to replace that screw so you're not having to do that every single time and end up damaging or eventually breaking off the head of that screw. So 4 screws to pull this bowl off. And I'll show you how to drain the fuel if you like to do that before going into winter, but you've got a screw on the bottom here. All you got to do is unscrew this a couple times. Fuel will start dumping out this bottom nipple here. You want to make sure you've got a hose coming off of this nipple. That way that fuel isn't dumping directly onto your motor. That can cause some discoloration or potentially a fire hazard if you start the four-wheeler shortly after. So again, make sure, going back together then, that you tighten this up. That way fuel isn't constantly dumping out this tab here. The other thing that happens is fuel will slosh around in your carburetor here in your bowl, and fuel will come up and go over top of this tab here, and then it'll run out the bottom. So that's why they tell you need to have a fuel hose on the bottom, because that's happening while you're riding a lot of times. You don't even know it. Fuel is sloshing around in there, or if it's on the trailer, sloshing around, and then dumps out that port there. So always good practice to have a hose on the bottom of that, just to prevent forest fires. So our jets here, we've got a main jet here, secondary main here, and our pilot jet here. If your four-wheeler's having a hard time starting, I would start with this pilot jet. It's the smallest port of all the 3 jets, and you want to make sure that you can see through it. Take compressed air, blow through it, carbon choke cleaner, blow through it, hold it up to light, make sure you can see through it without any issues. So that's your pilot jet. That's a very, very small jet. I believe this one, 17.5, I don't know how that can be. That's really small. So anyways, make sure that those are cleaned out. Secondary main is this one here. It's the one that doesn't have the cap kind of over top of it. And the secondary main and the main jet look identical, but the main jet has a bigger port. So same thing, make sure you can see through the secondary main, make sure it's cleaned out, blow through it with compressed air. And we've got our main jet here. It's got this cap kind of over top of it, or running beside it here. It's kind of a spacer, and then it's got ports in here. You want to make sure that this is in the correct position going back together. I don't think it'll allow you to put it on there upside down, but as far as the holes on the side, doesn't matter which direction those are, but just make sure that that pilot jet, or excuse me, that main jet is cleaned out, make sure it's in good condition, and then you drop it down in that area there to put back together. So those are the jets. Now we've got our needle and seat here. Fuel from your fuel tank is going to go in this tab here, and it's going to come out where your needle and seat are here. I'm gonna go ahead and pull that, take a Phillips screwdriver, loosen that a couple turns. It doesn't even have to be extremely loose or removed completely. Take this pin and push it out of there, and then you'll pull that float up at that time. And this float is adjustable, so we've got a metal tab here that can be adjusted up or down depending on if you're getting too much fuel or not enough fuel. So if that needle is grooved, or there's debris in here, or this is squared, then you want to make sure that you replace the needle and seat. Don't just try to fix your problems by adjusting that tab there. You could cause potentially dangerous happening to your motor by not getting enough fuel, or constantly fuel dripping on your floor if you're getting too much fuel into that bottom bowl there. So inspect that, adjust it if you need to, but don't adjust it when you actually need to replace it. Now to replace that seat, then you got a small Phillips screw here. Remove that screw completely, grab a hold of this seat here, pull it out, stick the new one in there. It's got an O-ring on there. You want to make sure you inspect that O-ring, make sure it's in good condition. So going back together then, I take and make sure that doesn't matter which direction this needle goes on here. You spin it all the way around, whatever you want to do. Just stick it on that tab there and slide it down into that that seat there, and then slide that pin in underneath of that Phillips screw there. And just kind of a trick, if you are replacing the fuel line, make sure you do that before you adjust or before you clean your carburetor. A lot of times when you're putting new fuel line on, a piece of that rubber will go into this port here, causing your float to stick open, causing your fuel to continuously flow into your bowl there, and you'll have a serious fuel leak problem on the floor of your shop. So main jet, again, make sure that cap goes on. Run that main jet down in there. These don't have to be tight. They are brass jets going into a aluminum carburetor, so nothing has to be extremely tight. Secondary main goes beside it. Snug that up, and then we've got our pilot jet. Again, make sure with as small port as this is, you want to make sure that that's cleaned out. You can take carbon choke cleaner, spray all this out at any point, clean it out really good with compressed air. We've got your air fuel screw right here. To adjust that, you run that all the way down, and then look at your manual to see where it shows you to adjust it. Typically it's about a turn and a half out, possibly 2 turns out, maybe a little bit more. But you don't want to take and run this flat screw all the way down, or you will be starving that four-wheeler. So make sure, forgot to show you this, make sure that this O-ring here is in good condition. If you've ordered a carb rebuild kit, it'll come with that O-ring. You want to make sure you replace that. So those have a tendency of getting dried out and cracking and then causing a leak. So Phillips screws all the way in, and then the longest of the 4 will go with this idle screw mount here. It's a little wire mount, just requires a little bit longer screw there to mount it properly. So snug those up. We'll go up to the diaphragm then. Before we do that, I'll show you the little cover on the side of your carburetor. 9 times out of 10, you don't even have to pull this cover off. I like to do it just to inspect it and check any debris, but it is spring loaded, so I like to keep my thumb on top of there while I'm removing these screws. 2 screws is all you have in this side cover here. Then underneath of it is a rubber diaphragm. You've got your spring here and then your cover. So I'm not going to pull this rubber diaphragm. If it is ripped, you want to replace that. But if it's not ripped, I don't want to take the chance of pulling it off of there and causing damage. So going back together then, make sure this cover goes on the same way that you took it off. Make sure that this spring seats properly. Going back together here. Take and hold it down while you put these screws in, that way it doesn't pop off of there. Again, just good practice to check underneath that cover, make sure everything's intact and working, and snug those screws back up. Now for the diaphragm, take and pull the 2 screws. Again, I like to take my finger, hold over top of it here. This is spring loaded as well, not very much tension on this as well either, but it can pop off of there. 2 Phillips screws, pull this cap. Spring a lot of times will come with it. That spring isn't connected, you can pull it off of there. Now for the diaphragm, just take and push that up. If it's sticking to the carburetor, you want to make sure you kind of pry it off of there slowly so it doesn't rip that diaphragm. This diaphragm is directional, so it'll only go one way, and you want to make sure you don't force it in the wrong direction there. So to adjust this needle or clean or replace, take a pair of small screwdrivers, pull up on this little cap there, and there's a spring underneath, so make sure it doesn't go flying. So there is the cap there. It's got an O-ring on it to help hold that down, and it's got this spring. That spring will come off a lot of times. So needle then, take and push it out. I like to grab my pliers here, slide that needle out. There is spacers and washers, and I'll show you the direction of those as well. So we've got a washer underneath of this plastic washer, and then we've got a little clip here that is adjustable. And then we've got a washer on top here. So several different components. You want to make sure you put those in the right order. That way you're not allowing too much fuel to be sucked up or not enough fuel to be sucked up through that main jet. So we've got the washer underneath, plastic washer, the clip, and then we've got this washer here. I take and grab a hold of that. Take this slide here. Make sure you find the right hole to go through. Slide that down. Take this cap then. Same thing, slide it down. Push it down there. Now you should be able to push this needle up and down just a hair, probably 1/8 of an inch or less. But if it goes flying, you didn't do something right, you want to make sure you do that again. Or if it doesn't slide up and down, then you don't have your spring in there correctly, or there's too many washers in one area. So next thing then, take your finger, slide it underneath there. I take and I fold this down real carefully so you don't rip that diaphragm. So it looks like that. I then take my finger, put it underneath here. Make sure that that needle goes down into that correct port down below there. And that's going down into that main jet area. If this diaphragm gets water or carb clean, fuel or carb clean on it, you want to make sure you dry it out. You can put it in the windowsill, let the sun beat down on it for a little bit, put it in front of a fan, but you want to make sure you clean it out really well. With my finger still held under that slide there, that way it doesn't push all the way down. If you were to push all the way down, a lot of times it would pull right out of this groove there. That's why I like to keep it pushed down like that. And then keep my finger underneath of it. That way everything seats like it should. Take my cap then, make sure that hole is lined up with that port there. Still have my finger underneath of that slide to keep that diaphragm from pushing down. Now you can let your finger off that diaphragm, or that slide down below there. But just keep pressure on this cap so your diaphragm doesn't slide out of place there. And then take and run these screws down. These are specific screws with spacers. That way it keeps that cap from sliding anywhere. So that is the carb clean on a Yamaha Kodiak 400. If you've got questions or comments, make sure you leave those below. If this video has been helpful, please subscribe, like, and share this. Thanks a lot.